come to Nature 5, and we're shifting our frame. And our frame is 4 presentations that make a month. And that frame is a lunar cycle. And we're trying to adjust our learning to the deepest possible natural rhythms. The day-night cycle, the diurnal cycle, is not a polarity and it's not a dualism. The best way to describe it is the day follows the night naturally, and the night gives place to the dawn and the new day emerges. In ancient Egypt, even before 3000 BC, the first dynasty, and the Nakata culture, Nakata II especially, that was there for several thousand years before the first dynasty, 6,000 BC. There are already deep traces that the wisdom cycle was always posited on the way in which day and night have their special kind of cooperation, that the day emerges into form from the night's passage, so that the night is a dynamic and the day is an energy form. The night has the energy in a dynamic process, and the day emerges as an energized form that now marks something which we would call form. But the relationship of process and form, day and night, that diurnal, is not a polarity, not a duality. The stability of form is made by polarity. That in the process phase, what one has is an ongoing flow. And as that flow enters into a curl, a kind of a chiral curl, it ties the momentum of the dynamic into a bow, which at the end of the duration of the form, the bow is untied and you have the flow of the process again. So that the ancient understanding of forms is that they are tied in a bow because polarity allows for this, to cinch it and keep it stable, but if you pull on it in the return to the dynamic, the bow comes free and one has the process again unencumbered, and yet one can retie, one can rebow, one can re-emerge. And the reason for this is that the emergence is not a static thing. If it were a static thing, it could not go back into its dynamic easily, and sometimes not at all. This is known as cinching a knot instead of tying a bow. So if you make forms that knot so that they don't go back into a dynamic, now you have an interruption of nature. One of the earliest interruptions of nature is the way that people used to keep track of days, of time, by tying knots in a string. In the Inca language called a quipu. It is an ancient way of counting the knots and then tallying up what you have in terms of form that has been taken out of its process, and now one can have those forms, whatever those knots represent. Whatever those days are, one can own those days. The same thing as fencing in land. Now you own this plot of land. It is no longer in nature. It is in your ownership, your portfolio. And so owning by measurement has two distinct modes. One is to not, so that now you own this and you can buy and sell this on your own and you don't have to consult nature. Nature now is commandeered in such a way that what can it do? And of course we live in an age where with earthquakes and tsunamis and many other hurricanes, we understand what nature can do very well. And mostly in the past, men and women around the world have understood. Do not tie knots, tie bows. You can use those forms and still have a measurement, but the measurement is not one of a static thing, but it is the emergence of an energized complement to the dynamic. And what we're looking at in nature, and the way that we're looking at it, is to have the sense that nature is this dynamic, and we're spending a whole 3 lunar month cycle called a season. We're spending a season looking at nature. And then we will spend a second season looking at ritual action that makes existential forms that hold. They tie bows in such a special way that one can now shift one's attention from the dynamic to the form. And so our learning will have, for the first half year, 2 seasons of 3 lunar cycles each, and each lunar cycle will have 30 days or 4 presentations on a Saturday morning, because we're taking a look also at the way in which the day, when kept track of in a bow, has a rhythm to it quite naturally to amount to a 7 to a week. Days build into a week, and 4 weeks build into a lunar cycle month. And those lunar cycle months, when you have 3 of them accumulated together, are a natural season, and 4 seasons will make an annual year, and all over the planet for all time, except for the last couple hundred years, in the kind of hubris that the Industrial Revolution introduced in spades in the early 1800s. More and more, our sense of civilization skewed away from founding itself in nature. And the reason why it did this is that in the 17th century was the first time that there was a triumph of tying knots in such a way that those knots seemed to stay. And the first place where this really took hold in a deep philosophic way was in France. And the star person of that era was Descartes, and his Cartesian geometry was a geometry to make sure that the mechanization of civilization could now proceed, and the first computers were mechanical devices made in the middle of the 1600s in France. And the Industrial Revolution of the early 1800s was a development eventually out of that matrix. Our learning is both an emergence of form out of process without destroying either's actuality, and to understand the relationship between them is one not of a static this and that or a duality, but that form itself, because it is the dynamic energy brought into a temporary polarized form. It isn't brought into it statically but iteratively, vibrationally. So that everywhere in the universe, whatever exists not just as a thing, but exists as a very high vibration, a very high iteration running into the trillions of times per second. So when we look at nature, we're looking at nature to understand in a progressively layered way, deeper and deeper, just how we have come to appreciate by the early 21st century, all of this actually has occurred vis-a-vis ourselves at a very crucial transform in planetary development. We're taking pairs of people and of their books to give ourselves that tuning fork, metronome, to carry that energy frequency, that vibration in a very deep, natural way that eventually will have a mysterious quality to it. And what makes it mysterious is that the energy wave will have a reference wave that is related to it, but not related in terms of a Cartesian geometry, not limited in terms of a mechanical, logical referentiality, but in terms of the living flow, which allows for another flow to be with it, but neither interfering with each other and setting up now a complexity of that flow. Decades ago, when I first was pioneering this, I used to use the Amazon River as the exemplar. The Amazon, being an enormous river, has from the Andes on down a certain distinctive color. But one of the largest rivers that flows into the Amazon is the Rio Negro, because the Rio Negro, because it comes from the Venezuelan highlands, has a lot of loamy silt in it, and literally the river is black. The water is black. And when it flows into the Amazon for hundreds of miles, the two rivers flow with each other without mixing. And it's only hundreds of miles downstream that you begin to get enough of the turbulence and interchange that the Amazon slowly then becomes some kind of a third mixed color all the way out to the deltas in the Atlantic Ocean. Culture, as a dynamic process, flows with nature in a very similar way. For most of the natural level, nature consists of just the dynamic and the flows. And the fact that two flows can flow together is a mysterious quality of nature, that they can eventually, under special conditions, begin to mix and make a third, introduces a third level to nature, to mysterious nature, to a magical nature that has transformed. And so we're looking at the way in which the dynamic of the universe works in three-level parfait all the time for us. We do not know when the first civilizations on the first planets and the first star systems occurred. Our star system was only formed 4.6 billion years ago. And the universe as we know it was in business 10 billion years before there was even a star or any planets where we are. And where we are, of course, is moving all the time. Moving not only because our star system, with about 25 others, have a local group that have their own kind of a motion and a swirl, but that local group is embedded in a whole swath of local groups that run into the billions, that is an arm of a huge structure called the Milky Way galaxy. And that some of the most prominent stars in our sky, like the Orion constellation, those stars are extremely close to us in terms of the galaxy, but they're not in our arm of the galaxy. And so when one looks to see Orion on any night, and you look to see those bright stars, the bright yellow star at the top left is Betelgeuse, and the bright star on the top right is Bellatrix, and the bright blue giant Rigel, and then the three stars for the belt. Those stars all exist in another arm of the Milky Way galaxy, and in between these arms, there's over 1,000 light years of rather open space. What we're looking at is the appreciation that nature becomes more and more dynamic and expansive of its scale and increasing of its depth, and that all the time that this is occurring to us, a mysterious quality of nature begins to, like sap, rise through the ability to have experience flow with it, and so experience itself begins to be experienced as part of the emergence of the mystery of nature. And later on, when there's a second transform into the magical, it will not be experience that deepens nature, not the flow of mythic culture that makes nature mysterious, but there'll be a third flow called consciousness, visionary consciousness, which will add the magical layer. It is still nature, but it has transformed again from the mysteriousness into the magical, into the conscious. And of course, the easiest rule of thumb, in nature it is water. In mysterious nature it has fermented and become wine. And in visionary consciousness, the wine has been distilled into cognac. And so the alchemical term, liqueur, refers to a double transform. The old alchemical symbol was always the double pelican, or the hermetic caduceus of the two, or any kind of a tuning fork, any kind of a quality where it isn't just two things, but the two meet. And they branch from the same cognate origin. And this holds all the way through. And the old Pythagorean esoteric thing was to recognize that the Greek letter lambda was the shape of how the tuning pair were not just two paired in a cognate polarity, but that they were able to carry each one different orders, so that those orders now had between them a special mysterious quality where the cognates were also in tune. And that one of the Greek lambda lines in Pythagorean theory was that these are squares, 1, 2, 4, 8. Whereas this line are cubes, 1, 3, 9, 27. And that, therefore, in mysterious nature, they are able to have ratios that hold in terms of oneness, so that 2 and 3 have a harmonic resonant capacity. And that 4 and 9 will have. And that 8 and 27. That one has the ability now to have ratios of the real form being always oneness, but a oneness that allows for there to be further, deeper, ratioable, proportional resonances, and that one can even go into a deep conscious transform of those ratios, of those proportions. And instead of just having stars and planets, you have the planets in their gravitational resonances that hold in special ratios. And it was discovered about 400 years ago by a very lovely man named Kepler, who was trying for the first time to understand why the orbit of Mars was not a circle but an ellipse. And the ratios and the math of the different planets, if they were also in ellipses, how could you come to understand just where they are and why they are there? And he found that if you take the squares of the period times in ratio of the cubes of the distance, that ratio will always be 1. And so if you take the squares of the period and the cube of the distance to Saturn and work that out mathematically, you will come close to 1. The same with Jupiter, the same with Mars, Venus, Mercury, the Earth. The return to unity is assured because the conscious transform, because it is a distilled, fermented carrier of nature, one is able consciously to go back to the unity that is in nature. But to go from the conscious understanding, from the magical, one doesn't go right away back to nature, one goes back to the mystery. And so the mysteriousness of nature is always the middle way. It's the middle path. The Buddha's middle path is neither nature nor consciousness, but mysterious nature. And it's that middle path that we're understanding now in this next lunar cycle of the phase of nature. In the first cycle, the first lunar cycle, for 4 presentations, we took Thoreau and the I Ching, going back to nature a la nature. A man who was, his most famous quote that I use on my DVDs, the most natural man is a man who is himself in all 4 seasons. In Chuang-Tzu, one of the phrases, joy and anger occurring as naturally as the 4 seasons. That one can go back to nature and immerse oneself deeper than the culture does. The individual can immerse themselves back into nature and be absorbed by it. One can literally go back into nature in such a way that there is no cultural difference that's apparent in your experience. One of the greatest examples of this was Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was one of the French Enlightenment geniuses who was taking great umbrage to the Cartesian, mechanical world view of nature. And he was greatly troubled by this. And he was also troubled by his own inner nature, which was to be somewhat of a rake when he was younger, and feeling guilty and feeling angry and feeling unmechanical. He rowed himself out on Lake Geneva and decided that he would just simply stop rowing and just sit in his rowboat way out on Lake Geneva. And as he did so, in his Confessions, he describes it beautifully and classically. He rode the motion of Lake Geneva until he disappeared into the motion. And he was just another drop of the water of Lake Geneva. And for a long time, and when he came out of that, Jean-Jacques Rousseau was totally changed forever. And out of this came a critique of culture-based society that ties knots, and he called it the social contract. And it was the beginning of the Enlightenment critique that false society was a knot abstracted out of nature and therefore had no way to be mysterious whatsoever. and no way to go from the mysterious on to any higher orders. And so what had to be done, first of all, was the ability to return back to nature. And of course, just about the time that Rousseau was doing that, many of the Europeans that had come to the New World, especially to the United States at that time, were experiencing that it wasn't that they were fearful of the savages in the wilderness out there, but that somehow they were getting acclimated to the land, to the landscape, and they were dissolving their individuality back, so that for the very first time, about the time that Rousseau was out on Lake Geneva, was the first time that you had Americans who became white Indians. And of course, the all-time great description of that transformation is by James Fenimore Cooper about Deerslayer, who at 17, running through the forest with Hurry Harry, and later on with his Mohican adopted father, Chingachgook, and his adopted brother, Uncas, had become a white Indian. What is extraordinary is that that experience of going back into nature in such a way that it obviates all of the knottedness, all of the quality of being separated from the natural flow. I had a friend who was a jet pilot in the Korean War, and a Finnish descent, a tough character. But his plane was so shot up that when he came into the air base in Korea, southern Korea, the plane just fragmented on the runway in the crash, and he was taken out of the wreckage of the plane and consigned to the dead. And he was put on a gurney, and fortunately some nurse detected a slight pulse, and he was rushed to hospitals, and for 3 or 4 years they patched him back together, and they brought him back and taught him to walk and talk again. And whenever he would get completely frustrated ever after that, he had a technique where he would take his kayak out of the marina in Marina del Rey here in Los Angeles and row himself out and let the Pacific Ocean's motion carry him for as long as it took to get back into the natural flow, sometimes over a day, sometimes far into the night. And he was always able to come back into that way. Our learning goes back into nature in just this way. But we're interested in getting ourselves acclimated to the, not just the dynamic of nature, but to the mysterious, deeper dynamic of nature, which requires a reference wave, and to the magical dynamic of mysterious nature, which requires a second reference wave. So we're using pairs to begin to establish the reference wave. Pairs that change in a lunar cycle. And the reference wave will be something that changes in a solar cycle for a whole year, for 12 lunar cycles, for 4 seasons. And the reference wave, because we're using pairs of people or pairs of books, the reference wave will be a single book that one will use for the entire year. The reading journey, Moby Dick, or the Odyssey, or the Tale of Genji, to begin with, Ovid's Metamorphoses. And by portioning out our reading of that reference wave book over the entire year, we give ourselves an ability to develop not only the flow of the dynamic of the natural development of our pairs in their lunar cycling articulation, but the annual reference wave will give us the ability to get into the mysteriousness of nature, of the whole integral cycle based on nature. But the second reference wave, because it has to have a conscious transform, a magical nature quality, we use something different. We use something that's in between the lunar and the solar cycle, which would be a seasonal. But it has to be a special conscious approach to the seasons. And so the conscious approach to the seasons is to have the collected notes of the previous cycle. And it is the notes of the previous cycle that establish the magical transform second reference wave. And so by reading the notes, the intellectual written conscious notes collected together by the season, by the phases, one establishes for the first time the ability to have that second conscious transform reference wave. And the reference wave will create not just the frequency of the original, but the first reference wave creates the ability to have a vector of the frequency. And the second reference wave creates the ability to have a second vector of the energy wave frequency. And when you have two vectors, now for the first time, you have a very sophisticated mathematical structure of high consciousness called the tensor. And Einstein used tensors to develop the theory of relativity. So that this learning, while it starts on the easiest day-night alternation, builds itself patiently until one could understand Einstein's and quantum physics, cosmos, in such a complete natural developmental wave that one doesn't realize until looking back in retrospect that in just 2 years you've come through the entire evolutionary history of the species right up to today. But in order to establish the depth of our natural penetration, I use the lunar cycle to go back in 3 giant steps, each one having a pair of foot movements that go back increasingly into the past. Thoreau goes back about 200 years. The I Ching goes back about 5,000 years. Now we're taking Mary Leakey and Jane Goodall. We're taking of Mary Leakey, her autobiography, Disclosing the Past. And we're taking of Jane Goodall, not her famous book, In the Shadow of Man, which in the last 35 years has been translated into over 50 languages. It's sold tens of millions of copies. But we're taking through the window her 30 years of life with the chimpanzees of Gombe Stream Preserve. We're taking these two women because Mary Leakey is right at the threshold and cusp of one of the most huge steps ever taken in human history. Her work goes back not 5,000 years, but first of all goes back about 50,000 years. And then she met the man of her life, Louis Leakey, and their work together took that 50,000 years and pushed it back 5 million years. And then under the tutelage of Louis and Mary Leakey, Jane Goodall came along with her examination of the great apes, the chimpanzees, and pushed it back 70 million years. And so now we have gone from Thoreau to Jane Goodall in just 2 months, and we've pushed back from our current interest in natural history and in rediscovering our way to come back into nature, back to the origins of primates 70 million years ago, which is a watershed. because three things happened at the same time 70 million years ago in evolution. The emergence of higher order primates like the great apes, the emergence of flowering plants, flowers, and the emergence of trees that are recognizable on the planet today. And so trees, flowers, and great primates all occur at the same time as a cognate wave in evolution. So that our next third pair will take us even deeper, even farther back. We want to take a look with Elizabeth Verba and her friend Niles Eldridge and their departed friend Stephen Jay Gould to take a look at evolution that pushes everything back to 500 million years ago. And paired with that, James Watson and Francis Crick's The Double Helix that pushes the origins back to 5 billion years ago just in this star system. And by finding organic traces in interstellar dust clouds, by finding organic traces in intergalactic dust clouds, one can see that we not only go back 5 billion years, but back to the very origins of organic molecules almost 15 billion years ago. And so in just 3 months, in just 12 presentations, we will take ourselves increasingly in these giant levels back into the nature of nature, back into the really mysterious nature of nature, and get ourselves ready for the ability to be open for that second transform, where the magic of visionary consciousness can come into play. One of the qualities of Louis Leakey, his biography is called White African, that he was raised in an area of Kenya where the boys he played with were all Kikuyus. And he grew up so that he was eventually an elder of the Kikuyu tribe. And when he was sent away as a young man to England for his university training, it was the first time that he discovered, he was quite surprised, that he did not dream in English, he dreamed in Kikuyu. He was a Kikuyu. He was a white African. And when there was a problem in Kenya with the Mau Mau, he was the only person of white color who was able to go and speak to Jomo Kenyatta personally. And he was received by Kenyatta, a fierce anti-European, as an elder of the Kikuyu tribe. Let's take a break and we'll come back. These are some of the drawings by Mary Leakey of prehistoric rock paintings in Tanzania in Africa. And her ability to go into these primordial sites and areas is one of the curious hallmarks of her person. Her father, Erskine Nicole, was a painter, an oil painter, and he was kind of a free spirit. And he didn't like to be tied down to any particular place, so he would go to various places in Europe and Africa and Asia, and he would paint for a while until his money ran out, and then he would gather his paintings and go to London and sell them, and immediately clear out of town because he didn't like to be tied down anywhere. When he was in Egypt one time, doing his paintings, he fell in love with a beautiful young woman, and they hit it off immediately, and of course, rather immediately, They not only got married, but she was found to be pregnant, and they were living on a houseboat on the Nile. And they talked about having the birth of this child, who would turn out to be Mary Leakey, on the houseboat on the Nile, but finally the more civilized family members got them to go to London immediately for the delivery, but they did not want to go to a hospital to have the child, so they went to a house of a friend, and Mary Leakey was delivered there in that house in London. But all of her life, she was always with her father's traveling wanderlust and her mother going along, so that she never had regular schooling at all. She was always immersed in this oasis of painting and this oasis of landscape and this place, and so she got this sense, almost like a mystical child, that home was not really any particular place, it was wherever you were interested to be. That could be a home as well. But on the other side of her family, her mother's family, were the Ferrers. And the Ferrers were quite famous in English history. One of her ancestors was, in the 1700s, in possession of some of the rarest Stone Age implements that were found in a brick quarry in Suffolk, England. And he wrote a monograph on it that when it was published, it caused him to be banished from the better parts of society, because he claimed that these stone implements that were found were back at a time when not only the landscape, but the flora and fauna of England were completely different. That the bones belonged to animals that were only found in Africa now, but that they had lived where England is, who knows how long ago. And of course, as Mary Leakey says, the better educated people in England of the time, Enlightenment England, yes, but only so far, they were still readers of the Old Testament. Man was created, and Adam was the first man, and that was datable to 4004 BC. And obviously, that puts it at a date that no human beings could have possibly lived, since the first man is 4000 BC. So nothing more was heard from that relative, or no one mentioned that particular publication for over 60 years. And then when it was mentioned again, it was mentioned because Darwin had brought out his Origin of Species in 1859, and someone remembered this paper by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. But by this time, the complication was not just that he did a bad thing of writing such an article back then, and now it's revived again, but here comes someone like Darwin saying that this is the nature of man to have emerged through evolution from the great apes. So it seems peculiarly natural that when Mary Leakey grew up to fall in love and marry, the man she married, one of his first great books is called Adam's Ancestors. The Evolution of Man and His Culture. This is a first edition of it. And it was published in May of 1934. And later on, in order to rub it in, L.S.B. Leakey, Louis Leakey, published a volume of collected essays, Adam or Ape? Did man come out of a special creation of Adam, or did he not evolve through who knows how long? And it was peculiar, because in the introduction, under natural selection, Louis Leakey takes the trouble to say, Now, when a variety of such an animal occurs, having increased power or capacity in any organ or sense, such increase is totally useless, is never called into action, and may even exist without the animal ever becoming aware of it. In the wild animal, on the contrary, all its faculties and powers being brought into full action are the necessities of existence. Any increase becomes immediately available, is strengthened by exercise, and must even slightly modify the food, the habits, the whole economy of the race. It creates, as it were, a new animal, one of superior powers, and which will necessarily increase in numbers and outlive those inferior to it. The difference is that a domestic animal belongs to, not nature, but that deeper level of nature which we are understanding has a mysterious quality, but part of its mysteriousness is that if you tame animals or you tame plants, you take them out of the natural dynamic and you put them into a special version of that dynamic, which has a mysteriousness, no doubt, but it is no longer a part of nature exclusively. It now has one foot in the culture. And we say of that culture now, with one foot in nature and one foot in culture, maintains its balance because the two flows flow together, and as long as they're together, one can stand, one can walk, one can move. But if the cultural foot moves in an anti-natural way, you will stumble, you will fall. We say in terms of evolutionary development that the natural man, the natural woman, lives in a Paleolithic absorption in nature, but that the cultural variant of that is the Neolithic, where instead of following the animals, one tames the animals and raises only certain animals. Instead of gathering the plants, one excerpts those plants, works with larger varieties of them until you begin to get something that originally in nature was just grass, a special goat grass that had 4 or 5 little grains at the top, that if you take that goat grass and you work with it in a Neolithic taming way that was done about 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, you can make a jump in that goat grass to a special grain called emmer that now has 16 grains at the head. And if you work with that emmer, you can now put it through a second transformation and you come up with bread wheat that is so heavy at the head with so many grains of grain, kernels of grain, that now harvesting bread wheat, you can very easily, on a plot of land, grow enough grain to make your bread for the whole year. The difficulty is that you have removed bread wheat from nature. And at the expense of the grass, instead of the energy of the natural plant going into just a few grains, but the grains were surrounded by these kinds of plant wings that allowed for natural goat grass to seed itself. And even with emmer, there was enough left over that occasionally in big winds, emmer could seed itself, but bread wheat could never seed itself. It didn't have any of the wings on the grains. All the energy, all the structure of the plant went into the grains. And so when it was ripe, if it was not harvested, it would just fall where it was and would never move from the spot. So that now man, in order to propagate bread wheat, had to sow the grains by hand. And so it was a cultural advance. It was a Neolithic advance, but it took away from the ability of the plants to be in nature. Now they also had one foot into man's culture. So that man now developed a mysteriousness and had to cooperate. His culture and his nature were two flows, two processes that could only work. His culture could only be sustained in the Neolithic if it flowed with nature and followed the seasons. Instead of following the animals, instead of gathering the plants in their special little wild harvests, one now followed the timeline of the seasons, the measurement by the moons, the measurement by the sun, the annual cycle, and the ability to make one's culture and nature mysteriously together. And yet a second transform comes when civilization rises, because civilization is not simply natural, nor is it Neolithically mysterious so that culture and nature can just together flow, but the second transform, the third level, is the visionary, conscious magic of civilization. Now you have something else. And consciousness in its vision process cannot flow with nature and culture. It's of a second transform. It's of a third order. It doesn't just flow with nature, but it comes around the other way and weaves with nature, both coming from different ways. Nature always comes from an integral wave. And if it's clockwise, consciousness will always be a differential wave that is complementary to it, different from it. It will be counterclockwise. If you live in a star system where the natural cycle is counterclockwise, visionary consciousness, if it develops in that star system, will be clockwise because they always weave, so that now one has not only to have the flow of culture and nature together, but you have visionary consciousness that not only weaves with nature, it has to weave also with the culture. But when it weaves, it transforms. It always changes. And its change is not in a natural fermentation transform. Its change is in a distillation. It distills what has already been once transformed. The natural water has become transformed into the cultural wine. But the conscious cognac has been distilled out of that wine and is of a different order, of a different mode. And so one has to deal with it in a completely expanded, different way. Now it's not just enough to have something integrate. Now you have to have a complementarity to that integration. The differential transform has to be rewoven, and that reweaving calls for a recalibration. So that civilization was like a double transform, that if it were not caught, it would end the ability for nature to sustain. Things will die out. If you take all of the energy from nature and you don't just put it into tamed plants and tamed animals, but you take all of the metals and all of the minerals from nature and you put them into man-made civilized constructs and you pay no attention to the natural flow, you will have a condition where even the oceans themselves will be unable to sustain life. Where the land forms anywhere on the planet will not be able to sustain life. Where all of a sudden the quality of nature, we were just talking during the break about the fact that all of the glaciers and Mount Kilimanjaro are melting for the first time since geologic ages. All the glaciers on Mount Kenya are almost all gone. The climate of the world has been beggared by extracting out without weaving back in. And so civilization becomes an enemy of nature, but it also becomes a killer of the mysterious. And the mysterious is killed not because of an enemy-type force fighting it, but it becomes killed because the mind only abstracts from it and doesn't participate in the transform. And so it is the deadening abstraction of the mind that is the fulcrum of the problem. The knot is tied there. It's not in nature. It's not even just in the ritual levels or in the mythic cultural levels, but it's in the symbolic mind. Gone abstract, hysterical, deadening, crazy. And in our time, all educations on the planet, everywhere, all traditional learnings have ended up in abstracted, deadening, killer modes, which is why this new education, not just new in content, new in form, but transformed in the deeper ways of visionary consciousness from a mysterious transform which is recognizable all over the planet for all time. Now, when we come back to looking at Mary Leakey and Louis Leakey, and we're spending 4 presentations on those two, one of the qualities that's interesting is how women, especially, become the carriers of the mysterious. Very frequently, the carriers of visionary consciousness have a masculine gender quality, but the carriers of the mysterious have now a feminine gender quality. And so one doesn't speak just of nature, one speaks of Mother Nature. One doesn't just speak of the vitality of the world, but the vitality of the caring world, who is a goddess, and Gaia, or the making of the whole shape of a mythological understanding of feminine goddesses, that there will be a quality for the mother, there'll be a quality not just for the mother, but the mother-daughter. There'll be a quality for the lover, a quality for the huntress, a quality for at least 6 different vectors. And when we get to our learning and get into myth, we're going to take those 6 goddesses, female goddesses of Greek mythology, as one of the metronomes of how this spreads itself and is recognizable once one sees the template of that process anywhere once. It is recognizable wherever you look, in whatever culture, whatever society, throughout the planet and throughout its history. The problem, though, is with civilized persons like ourselves who are more and more jailed by the egotistical convictions of an abstract mind gone crazy, cannot get back to nature. And so there was a great movement in the 1920s and 30s of the 20th century for men and women to find ways that they could take themselves out of society, out of the mind, and go back into primordial nature and get back to it. And that one of the keys to it was the ability to get back to the animals. And while Mary Leakey was at 23 deciding that she was going to go to Africa with Louis Leakey and go on one of his expeditions to try to find stone tools in some of the areas of Kenya, some of the islands in Lake Victoria. She went with him. And as she was going with him in 1934, the other woman that we're taking as a pair, Jane Morris Goodall, Jane Goodall, was being born also in London. But Jane Goodall, when she was born into a peculiar family just like Mary Leakey. But whereas Mary Leakey's father was a painter who painted all over the world in different places, her father, Jane Goodall's father, was one of the world's greatest race drivers. He's one of the few men ever to 10 times participate in the Le Mans and was a victor many times. And Morty Morris Goodall was one of these daredevil men who was absolutely fearless of pushing his machine in competition to every possible extreme. One great race driver in the 1940s cautioned a young race driver. He said, "You do not drive with your eyes or your hands. At that speed, you drive with the seat of your pants. If your car is not a part of you, and that car and you are a part of that road, you will never think fast enough to keep control." It's an advice that young jet pilots get when you train to be a jet pilot. They give you the rule of 7, that when you're at Mach 3, you will be in that accident before you even know, unless you have trained yourself to limit your frame to only keeping track of 7 things in a gestalt at any one time. And if something else shows up on an instrument, you automatically let something else out of that frame because you cannot keep track of more than a constellation of 7 things instantly at any one time. And so you train yourself to constantly revise your gestalt of operative reference to no more than 7 at any particular time. Because of this rule that came up in the late 1940s. Edwards Air Force Base, and one of the formulators of that was Chuck Yeager, the first man to break the sound barrier, October 14th, 1947. The concentration is not to keep concentrated on a focus of oneness, but to spread the oneness out in a gestalt of 7. In math, this is known as the Hamiltonian. That all of these points together constitute a ratio of attention that can be modified and shifted, but it can act as if it were one, because the relationality of all of them together will be a oneness of your flight, of the direction of your machine, of the car. So when Jane Goodall was growing up, she was acclimated on one hand to the wildness of her father and his daredevilness, and yet on the other side, her mother, Cecilia, came from a very particular kind of lineage where largely it was the women sticking together because Jane Goodall's mother was one of 4 daughters and she was the only one that ever married. And so when World War II came and she was like 5 years old, the father joined the Royal Engineers and was sent all over the world because he knew a lot about machines and contact and was daring. And he exited from the family so that Jane went with her mother and her young sister named Judy. Jeff, she was called in the family. And her mom, Jane's name was always Valerie Jane, and they called her VJ. And VJ, because she was the oldest, not only older than her sister, but that they had 2 other sisters that were friends of theirs that lived very close to the place in England that they went to. The 4 girls together grew up together as like a little group and eventually would form a club called the Alligator Club, where they had to learn to identify 10 plants by name, 10 animals by name, various orders, and all this was dreamed up by 11-year-old Jane Goodall. And that these girls learned to walk alligator style, one in front of the other, keeping exactly in the pace of their steps and keeping the attentiveness that wherever they looked in nature, they could name what it was. Plant, animal, condition. One time, Jane was missing for an entire day. They got the police out to look for her. They got the local military out to look for her. And just as the sun was going down, she showed up with straw in her hair. And they asked her where she had been. And she said, "I got curious about where eggs come from the chickens. So I went into the hen house and I waited for about 5 or 6 hours watching until a hen laid an egg and I could see where it came from." This is a little girl. She had this uncanny ability to both be daring and to be so patient that she would not move until the event occurred that she wanted to have occur. She lived not only with her sister and the other 2 girls, so there were 4 young girls, but there were 4 aunts, her mother and 3 aunts, and the house was headed by the grandmother. She was given a name Danny as her nickname. And so here Jane Goodall grew up in a world that was all matriarchal, and the only male presence was her mother's brother Eric, who was a surgeon in Hampshire, a suburb of London, and he would occasionally come down to where they were at Bournemouth in Dorset, England, down on the South English coast. And the house there was called the Birches, 3-story brick house. And her number one companion all through her childhood was a little chimpanzee doll that her father had given her on her first birthday, April 3rd, 1935. And she named the little chimp doll Jubilee. And in one of her earliest letters to her mother, we read, this is February 16th, 1942. She is not quite 7 years old. This is her first extant letter. Darling Mummy, the day before yesterday, Mr. and Mrs. Spence bought a big dog called Jackie who's going to live here until Uncle Marcel come back. I don't know how to spell that word. Yesterday, Danny gave me 2 China dogs, and I call them Trouble and Terry. And Jubilee has got a new dress. So already at 7, one finds Jane Goodall immensely capable of both patience and daring at the same time. An attribute that Mary Leakey had as well, but Mary Leakey's daring was not just to go to odd places and then be patient there. She went to odd times as well. She could go back in time so that when she, as we will get to her in the next couple of presentations, when she was with Louis Leakey out in Old Duvai Gorge, sifting patiently, not only for years, but for decades. They began work in 1935. They did not find the first fossil trace until 1959, 24 years. But her companions out there, because Louis liked to stay in camp, she went out and did the looking because she was very good at recognizing something that was out. And she took with her 5 Dalmatian dogs. And her Dalmatian dogs were a part of her protection from the wildness, the animals, the lions, the jackals, etc. But they were also her metronome of being into the animal world. so that she was looking not as a civilized person, not as a cultured human being, but she was looking, being completely immersed in the animal nature of the place, because she was looking for evidences of early man when early man was an animal, did not have any civilization, had no culture, only lived completely absorbed in nature. And when they found the first traces, it caused a consternation, just like the Frere ancestor who had caused the consternation of finding stone implements in the 1790s in a brick quarry in England. Only these were not stone tools. These were fragments of a skull that went back before there were tools, back several million years. And almost no one at the time wanted to give credence that we've already been shocked that maybe Adam was not the first man. Maybe Adam had ancestors. Maybe man went back some thousands of years. But it was almost too much for words to say that man must be millions of years old. We know now, just a couple of years ago, that in one of the depressions in northern Chad, near Imokusi, which is one of the highest mountains in the Sahara, over 11,000 feet, that the fragments of a skull of a hominid precursor, a relative of ours, goes back 7 million years. We're looking at our learning to acclimate ourselves to a nature which continuously expands back in time, takes level after level after level and opens it out, but in a special way. Not a mental expansion, which would be a game of parentheses. You say this and you put a parentheses and you add some expressions, and that's like an exponential power of that expression. Or you put that parentheses within a larger parentheses, which takes in the different superscripts and subscripts, and pretty soon you end up with a game. But reality is not a game. It has a curious quality to it. Emergence of form always emerges in an iterative, vibrational way that includes time as well as space in its very motion, so that one never gets a circle in nature. What you get is the circle that tends to be going round in its circularity, but it goes forward in the dynamic of natural motion. And when you do this, what you get instead of a circle is you get a spiral. Moving forward in time, dynamically, the circle will always make a helical structure. But it has a peculiar quality, because there are levels of registry that are very definite and have a staging way. The helix will be constantly opening itself up as you go out. So instead of just getting a nice little geometrical normal kind of circle become a helix, the helix constantly opens and opens and opens. And the image for that is the seashell called the Chambered Nautilus. That each segment of the chamber, as it opens progressively more and more in an algorithmic progression, so that one begins to understand that there is an invisible structure to the forms that come out of nature, and can only be there because the dynamic process of nature was not just natural, but also absorbed the mysteriousness as well, so that nature was now mysterious. But it absorbed the second transform, the magical, so that nature now, for civilized men and women, is not only natural and mysterious, but also visionarily mysterious, magical as well. It always has a transform in it. This is a quality that has come out more and more, and one can see it. when we look at nature, our helical expansion of it has opened more and more and more. The first time that there was such a thing as astrophysics was little more than 100 years ago. The first issue of Astrophysical Journal was published with the editor being George Ellery Hale. As a little boy in Chicago, his father built him a telescope in their backyard. Within a couple of years, the University of Chicago, that was very near their backyard, wanted to have someone who would organize an astronomy department for the university. They incorporated Hale because he had a nice telescope nearby. Within less than a generation, Hale got enough funds to build the Yerkes Observatory on Lake Geneva in southern Wisconsin. That was a huge telescope complex. And within just less than a generation of that, he got enough money to build Mount Wilson's 100-inch telescope up here just above Los Angeles. And within another generation of that, he got enough funding to build the Mount Palomar Observatory of 200-inch telescope on Palomar Mountain in Southern California. One man went from a backyard toy to a 200-inch telescope in less than 50 years. And now we have telescopes that are more than 10, 11 meters in diameter, and 4 of them in Chile are organized so that together the 4 10-meter telescopes can work as one gigantic telescope the size of almost a football field. All this in about 100 years. The development of our civilization has taken a visionary, conscious jump so that the opening up of it is on such a scale that the very next movement goes beyond the bounds that one could even dream of, beyond the even invisible, wild suppositions that one could dream up. The actuality is going to go beyond that. And this very next move is in these next 10 years. By 2015, by 2016, it will be opened to an expanse where the helix of the natural will literally be beyond any capacity for belief. It will not be beyond the capacity for wonder and for learning. That's why our learning has this quality. Jane Goodall's favorite readings were Dr. Dolittle, who had all these animals that were his friends. And she read Tarzan. All the Tarzan tales. These are first editions. Tarzan of the Apes, The Beasts of Tarzan, and especially this 1929 illustrated Tarzan, book number 1. And in the illustrations, one finds little comic cartoons. One of the illustrations here reads, as Tarzan and Jane clinch, the veil of centuries of civilization and culture were swept from Jane. It was a primeval woman who sprang forward with outstretched arms toward the primal man who had fought for her and won her. And Tarzan took his woman in his arms and smothered her upturned, panting lips with kisses. More next week.